This week on Quadriga, world markets in disarray, politicians out of their depth. It felt like 2008 all over again as markets plunged on fears that leaders on both sides of the Atlantic are helpless to prevent renewed recession. Partisan bickering in the U.S. provoked round condemnation and a downgrade from ratings agency Standard&Poor's. Panic spread in Europe, too, on doubts that central bankers and governments will find a workable strategy to keep eurozone members from going bankrupt. Your host, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga, the international talk show on DW-TV. Have the politicians run out of tools? What's in store for the world economy? Those are the questions we want to talk about today with three experts who've been watching world economic developments.
Ursula Weidenfeld reports on economic topics for the internet and other media. A former editor at the Financial Times Germany, she won the Ludwig Erhard Prize for Business Journalism in 2008. Marcus Walker covers German and European affairs for the U.S. newspaper The Wall Street Journal. The German-born Englishman is based in Berlin. Kai A. Conrad heads Germany's Max Planck Institute for Tax Law and Public Finance and is co-editor of the Journal of Public Economics, as well as chairman of the Research Council at the German Ministry of Finance.
Kai Conrad, is this the week when the world has realized that the emperor has no clothes on? Have the politicians run out of tools for fighting the debt crisis?
Yeah, it's actually surprising that it happens now, but it's not surprising that it happens in some sense. I mean, we had the last serious attempt by the European leaders to convince the markets that there will never be a bailout of that there will be no bankruptcy of European members of the eurozone, and I think the markets realize that that politicians actually cannot guarantee that.
So, what's in store? Are we looking at a likely double-dip recession worldwide?
The implications for the real economy are difficult to predict, actually. It's probably easier to predict what's going to happen on the European debt market.
Marcus Walker, this week's jitters were precipitated in large part because of Standard&Poor's downgrade of U.S. debt. And yet, where did investors flee to when the market started plunging? Into Treasury securities. So is Standard&Poor's wrong? Is the U.S. economy much healthier than they're claiming?
No, they're not wrong in this case. It is a bizarre and perverse effect that bad news from the US leads to a flight to safety. But we've learned in the last 3 years that markets really have two broad moods. It's either risk on and risk off. And when it's risk off, the money flows very strongly into so-called safe havens, even downgraded US treasuries. And it's a very odd feature of the world we live in, that the main victim of the S&P downgrade was Italian government bonds.
Ursula Weidenfeld, some people are saying that the real tipping point for the world economy in the sense of a Lehman Brothers-style debacle is not in the U.S., but right here in Europe, that the problem in Europe is far more intractable. Do you think that's right?
They may be right in terms of the question, how does politics work and how does it, do decisions come how could you and can you tackle the problems in terms of political decisions? So I think Europe is a more difficult place today because there are some more countries which have to be asked, some more parliaments which have to agree with the politics which is found by the European Commissions or by the governments.
Yet it's only been a couple of weeks since European leaders supposedly came up with a foolproof solution. So what's gone wrong?
Well, I think it is something of trial and error. There is no big solution for Europe, even as well as to the US. There is no big solution for the US too. So they have to try and find ways out of the crisis, and sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. In the last 2 weeks, that they weren't.
Kai Conrad, was the deal that was worked out, also with German government participation as well, of course, was it deficient? Are the market's jitters justified, or is it simply a question of timing here?
What we observe is since, I think, early last year, is that the guarantees extended to the governments in the eurozone that are in bad shape in terms of their public finances, that these guarantees have been extended stepwise and stepwise and stepwise. And the politicians tried to play psychology, essentially. They didn't try to address the real problems. They tried to convince the market that there is no real problem and there will be no that these countries can eventually manage with their problems. And so this has come in several steps, and the latest step is the one you mentioned, which is the agreements of July, which extended essentially the mutual guarantees given to members of the eurozone, and also made another step towards a common European financing of government debt inside Europe. But I think this is going to fail like all the other attempts we have seen over the last 14, 16 months.
And what's the consequence of that failure then?
This is hard to say. The problem is 16 months ago, you could have done something about the problem. You could have prepared the Eurozone and the rest of the world economy for a restructuring of members of the Eurozone by making their financial systems resilient, by giving equity to the banking system, by re-regulating the banking system much more dramatically than it actually happened. And my expectation actually in May last year was that they would exactly do this. They would actually shield the countries with problems from the market and then would use the time gained by this to do all the tasks they actually had to do. But they didn't. They just played psychology. They just said, there is no real problem. It's just psychology. It's just the rating agencies. It's just some bad players in the market that speculate and so on. There is no real problem. We have nothing to do. And now they are in a situation where there is almost no time left for applying the right tools.
But I don't agree, because I think that they didn't say we have no problem. Everybody was aware that there are severe problems and that they have to be solved. But I think that they always said, well, we are buying time and we will find solutions within the board time. And you are right when you said that they are running out of time now. But I think that they are going to find solutions, and the European thinking 2 weeks ago, it isn't the government, the parliaments have to agree with that, and they probably will do that in the beginning of September. So we are in an in-between situation, whether it will work out or not.
That's the timing issue. But Marcus Walker, is it really so much a question of political will, or do we also have a problem simply of scale? Aren't there some indebted countries in the eurozone that are just too big to bail out?
That's certainly true. It's a problem of institutional constraints, because if you look at the Eurozone as a whole, if you just add up all the data about debt, GDP and deficits, the Eurozone is actually quite a healthy economy. It has a much smaller overall deficit than the US or the UK or Japan, but it's not one fiscal actor. It's not a fiscal union for political reasons. So it's a very odd construction that has one currency, which effectively means you're all tied to each other if somebody goes bust, but it doesn't have common fiscal institutions. And Europe has been trying to muddle through for the past year without resolving that contradiction. And I think the time for muddling through is going to run out pretty soon, and Europe will be forced to consider what kind of fiscal union it's going to be.
But that's not going to solve the immediate problem, is it? We're seeing attacks on French debt now, on Italy. What do you do to rescue those countries if they come under really severe attack?
Yeah, the only immediate solution is ECB bond buying. They are the only fire brigade in town that has any water left that they can use now. I mean, everything governments do needs parliamentary approval and takes months. So we're going to see the central bank financing countries like Italy and Spain for some time.
But that means that they will be part of the game in Europe too.
The ECB? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they already are. I mean, their balance sheet has been slowly becoming a big part of the game. Yeah.
Of course, the European Central Bank, or ECB, has very much been part of the game, and detractors say it's actually making the problem worse rather than better.
In theory, its role is clearly circumscribed. The European Central Bank is there to fight inflation, not to fight insolvency, unemployment, or other political ills, which is why it's supposedly independent of the politicians. In practice, it's a different story. The ECB has been buying up masses of sovereign debt. Just last Monday, it purchased a big batch of Italian and Spanish bonds, thereby at least temporarily reducing those countries' borrowing costs, but not necessarily their fundamental economic problems. Indeed, critics say the bank is simply prolonging their profligacy like a pusher feeding the habit of a junkie.
Kai Conrad, that's pretty strong criticism, a pusher feeding the habit of a junkie. Is it justified?
I think it's a very difficult situation for the ECB, and it's not the fault of the ECB that it's in this position. It's the fault of the politicians. They didn't make their homework for the last 15 months. And I think I disagree to what you were saying. They're still not doing their homework. I mean, if I see, for instance, what have been decided in July last month, to hand out to hand out credit to Greece and not making Greece pay interest for another 10 years. This, to me, looks like delaying the real problem for 10 years until you are not in office or any longer, and really to shift the problem away from your immediate radar to the radar of the future. And this is an indication for me that politicians don't address the real problems. So they try to persuade people that there is no real problem and shift it into the future.
Well, I think that, especially in the case of Greece, nearly everybody, at least in Europe or at least in Germany, expects that there will be a haircut or something like this in the next 2 years.
Debt. Yeah. Just for the no, go on. I'm just translating for our viewers who may not know what a haircut is.
So I think you are right when you say they try to delay the solutions to just cover the next elections or whatever. But I think that the way behind is quite clearly to be seen.
I mean, this is the common strand between the European crisis and the mess in the US, right? Because there too, politicians are not under pressure to do anything to address the long-term problems. Obama is clearly focusing on his re-election chances, and the Tea Party element within the Republicans trying to make good on their very rigid pledges that there will be no tax increases of any kind, including eliminating tax breaks. And this means that both of them have other priorities. It's not fixing the long-term fiscal problems.
Germany, of course, Kai Conrad, has been worried about what's being called here a transfer union, the idea that we are on a slippery slope toward a eurozone in which the Germans will be the paymaster for countries that don't have their economic houses in order. On the other hand, Germany has been the prime beneficiary in the eurozone. So isn't it only fair if it now has to pick up a disproportionate share of the tab?
The issue about main beneficiary is highly debated, actually. Some people argue that the main beneficiaries have been the countries that had the largest growth rate in the last 10 years, and this was certainly not Germany. And maybe there have been some beneficiaries among the export industry in Germany, but the German population certainly was not the main beneficiary. I think Germans are particularly sensitive to this topic because in their own country they suffer from transfer union for something like 15, 20 years. There is
in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the transfers to the east?
Even before, there is some between the Deutsche Länder, they have to pay for each other in terms of just trying to find the same living standard to every of this German Länder. So they are used to it since 40, 50 years.
Let me give you an example. There is a small state 500,000 inhabitants plus a few more in the northern part of Germany. It's called Bremen. And Bremen went to the Supreme Court something like in the very late 80s and got a Supreme Court ruling in 92 that it should be bailed out by the rest of Germany. And then there have been a bailout for 10 years, and to this little part of the country went an extra of something like 8.5 billion in this time period just to get rid of their budgetary problems. And in the end, after these 10 years, their budgetary problem was actually larger than it was before. And they got even more money. And nowadays, Bremen is the most indebted state in Germany still, with something like 25,000 euro per capita. That's about what you have in Germany on a per capita basis on average as well. So in Bremen, you have this amount plus what you have on the federal level. So they are more indebted than ever, although they got this huge bailout. So it's this history in Germany that makes people very concerned about this.
And yet that transfer union within Germany is there, of course, for purposes of promoting solidarity within the country. Solidarity is, of course, very much the issue in the eurozone, but it's also very much the issue in the U.S., Marcus Walker. And interestingly enough, when you talk about the political will for a long-term solution, we're not seeing a lot of solidarity there, particularly not intergenerational solidarity.
No, I mean, I think that this is an entirely unnecessary crisis in the US, and that's the difference between the US fiscal mess and the one in Europe. I think this was a crisis of necessity in Europe that was brought about by the structural inadequacy of the monetary union, whereas the US crisis is a crisis of choice. I mean, I think that the intergenerational problem is something that all developed countries face that have rising healthcare and pension costs and aging populations. But what has happened in the US is also a political backlash against the first financial bailout. That is one way to interpret this phenomenon of the Tea Party and the rightward shift of the Republican Party on taxes, especially on government spending.
And do you think the downgrade, the Standard & Poor's downgrade, was a wake-up call that will focus minds on this new bipartisan commission that's supposed to find additional budget cuts?
No, I doubt it very much. I doubt this bipartisan commission will be able to overcome the deep ideological divisions. It won't have the authority or the power to move either party towards the centre ground. Well, I mean, you could say that one of the parties probably is on the centre-right and the other is to the right of it, if you look at it from a European point of view. But the gap between them is huge and it won't be solved by any committee.
There is one renowned U.S. economist who says even if the parties don't come up with a comprehensive solution, there's a fairly easy fix if only people would think outside the box.
All the U.S. needs to reduce its debt is cultivate a healthy rate of inflation, says the former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. 4 to 6% a year is all it would take, says Harvard professor Kenneth Rogoff, who recommends that the government and the Fed ignore the conventional wisdom and see inflation as boon rather than bane. Wouldn't rising prices slow growth? Hardly, says Rogoff. It's not like there's a promising upturn just around the corner. That won't happen as long as public debt everywhere is so high. For now, we're going to see moderate growth of 1 or 2%.
Ursula Weidenfeld, is he right? Is inflation the answer for the U.S.? And if so, what it would mean for everybody else?
Maybe it can be an answer for the U.S., but it's certainly not an option for Europe. So if you just look at the European history, you see that there have been 2 big inflations in the last century after the 2 world wars. And I think that the experience was that inflation is something of making the middle classes pay for the debt everybody has made. So the fair way would be tax rises if you have to rethink your expenditure. So I think inflation may be an elegant way on paper and on the theory, but it will not work in practice.
Kai Conrad, what do you think? Inflation as a solution?
Yes, if you combine it with forcing pension funds into buying the debt they then don't like.
How do you do that?
Yeah, this has been done in the past. I mean, Italy, for instance, after World War I has. The First World War, they were highly indebted, and they had a serious crisis on public debt. And what they did, they forced people who had shares on this to extend the time period. They had inflation, and then if you have this jointly, you have long-term debt, and then you have inflation. Then actually you devaluate the debt that the government has. But if you have short-term debt, then inflation is not a way out, because next round, when the debt will be prolonged, then the interest rate which is charged by those who give the government money will just be increased by the inflation rate. So unless you permanently increase the inflation rate per se, and even this would be anticipated after a while, inflation is not really a safe way out.
Marcus Walker, what does seem clear from all the statistics we're seeing, including announcements by U.S. government officials this week, is that U.S. growth is likely to be very, very slow at best for the next couple of years. What does it mean for the rest of the world if the U.S. motor slows down?
Well, it means that the whole world will grow very slowly unless somebody else can act as the source of final demand. But there's really nobody who can replace the U.S. consumer or U.S. business investment.
Even China's putting the lid on at the moment, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely, because they've had to clamp down on inflation that threatened to get out of control. But China is going to have to, I think the challenge for China is probably the biggest of all, because its whole business model has relied on a massive amount of investment spending at home. And that was okay so long as you could sell all the stuff that was being produced to the US consumer. But if US growth is low, then China is going to have to rethink its internal structure of its economy. Like, can they really maintain a 50% investment to GDP rate? This is absurd and unsustainable. Can they really persist with this currency policy of an undervalued yuan, which has been supporting exports? But if the exports are not growing, then you might as well just let the yuan rise. And actually, that would help your own internal consumer spending. So I think there's a huge challenge for China. For the Europeans too, growth in the past decade, when it happened, came above all through exports. And Europe is going to have to grow very slowly, because I don't think that Europe is capable of growing through internal demand.
Ursula Weidenfeld, pretty dire outlook for Germany. Germany's been enjoying what seems like an almost anomalous boom for the last couple of years, an incredible recovery after the financial crisis, but very, very export-based. Do you think it's going to come to an abrupt halt?
I'm not sure whether that will be abrupt, but Germany will have just slowing down in growth. And if you look at France doesn't grow at all or didn't grow at all in the second quarter. So even the eurozone will have slower times ahead.
Kai Conrad, what does this mean then, taking us back to the eurozone crisis? If growth were to slow down, if even Germany's coffers are no longer as full as they have been, are we going to see a shattering of the eurozone? Are we going to see some countries simply have to leave it?
I think it really depends very much on the reaction from the side of politics. So I think it's still time to generate a eurozone that builds on two major principles, namely autonomy and responsibility of the single member states. We are in a situation in which we have a lot of autonomy, but we have no responsibility. So typically these two things should come together. We know this from our own consumer behavior, and it's pretty much the same in the eurozone. We have to establish this responsibility, that is, you are responsible for your debt, and if you don't manage your own debt, then you get a restructuring, and this must be credible. And if we manage to get to these institutions, then I think the eurozone will function very well.
But of course, two of the countries that have actually been taking some pretty strong moves to get their budgetary situations under control, Italy and France, have been under very severe attack.
Yeah, I know. I mean, they are in a situation where they should actually be restructured, because they are indebted to a degree where it's almost impossible to solve the problem by doing just homework. But you have actually to get rid of your debt by other means, namely telling those who gave the money to you that they don't get it back. Part of it, at least. But at the moment, the European leaders were not willing to let them do that, essentially. They were saying, no, this should not happen to you. You should not be allowed even to do this, because if you do this, then you infect us and the other countries and so on. And that has led to this unfortunate development in which there has been one rescue device after the other, each one bigger than the former one, trying to convince the markets that what actually can happen, and history has shown that it can happen, won't happen in Greece and Portugal and so on.
Yeah.
Marcus Walker, if you could advise the politicians, the topic of our show, of course, is whether they have any tools left, what would you tell them to do?
Well, they have a choice now between doing the June-July deal again, but doing it properly, or building a fully-fledged fiscal union. What they did wrong
Don't they need to do both?
Well, no, these are exclusive things because, as Kai said, the June-July negotiations were about restructuring Greece's debt and ring-fencing the other countries to protect them from contagion. But the problem is that they did only a little bit of both. They restructured Greece, they gave it a very, very small amount of debt relief, and they gave the other countries inadequate protection. So you had the market panic, you haven't really reduced Greece's debt, and the ECB was left to protect Italy and Spain. The idea was correct, the execution was terrible. If you can't do that, then you just have to make one fiscal union out of the eurozone.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in.